The Virginia chapter of the NAACP, along with a group of students, are filing a lawsuit against the Shenandoah School Board after it approved renaming two public schools after Confederate military leaders. It marks the latest development in an ongoing battle over Mount View High and Honey Run Elementary, formerly Stonewall Jackson High and Ashby Lee Elementary. For context, Jackson and Lee were both Confederate generals during the Civil War. The two schools were renamed in 2020 after racial justice advocates urged institutions nationwide to change building names and remove statues that honored Confederates.
In a statement reacting to the news, the president of the Virginia NAACP chapter said, quote, "My belief is the Shenandoah County School Board reaffirmed their commitment to white supremacy, and when students walk through halls of the renamed Stonewall Jackson High School and Ashby Lee Elementary School, they will do so with inescapable reminders of Confederate legacies that enslaved and discriminated against African-descended people. This community deserves better." The lawsuit alleges the school board violated the First and 14th Amendments, along with Title IX and the Equal Education Opportunities Act. So, Amber, this has been a big part of the movement in the United States of continued racial equality. We saw people taking down Confederate statues across the South. And as someone who grew up in the North and heard a teaching of history there and has now moved to the South, I am critical of how that history is taught, simply because the way that we treat drug crimes in the United States. So if someone were to sell marijuana, cocaine, hard drugs, things that are illegal in the U.S., they typically get a harsher sentencing and are treated harsher in our justice system than someone buying and using the drugs. And that was precisely the economic circumstances of slavery in the United States. The North was not the good guys. They weren't, worse than the South. It's just they were both bad. And I think because this war was one fought in part to free the slaves, that's important, but it was also fought for a lot of people in the South over economic reasons that are legitimate and not the typical ones people talk about. Because the North was dependent on the same slavery the South was, the North just wanted very cheap, basic, raw goods, the crops sent directly up to them that were sold for extremely low prices to the North because they depended upon free labor, and then the North would finish the goods, package them, and sell them for much higher and export them and make a ton of money off of slavery. They were also dependent on slavery. And so to expect the same prices to be given if slaves were free was a part of the contention. And of course, Frederick Douglass had to convince Abraham Lincoln that freeing the slaves should be a part of the war. It wasn't like Lincoln was this really good guy. It came out of radical Black organizing. But I will say that doesn't mean I think there should be Confederate statues. I don't think British people living in the United States should be like, oh, this is our Charles Cornwallis Elementary School. People will be upset about that, not because the history doesn't exist, but because, you guys lost.
Yeah, so in this case, what happens with these schools is that they apparently went through a process to change the names without input from the community. And the reason they changed them back is because they held a vote in, I think, somewhere between 91 to 93% of the taxpaying residents said that they wanted the Confederate names to return. So it's sort of like a democracy in action type of situation. But I think even if we just dig into the reasons why these schools were named after these individuals in the first place, it's important to understand the sort of contextual history surrounding figures like Stonewall Jackson, Robert E. Lee, and Turner Ashby. Actually, none of these individuals were particularly pro-slavery. None of them were really fighting for economic reasons on behalf of the South. All three of them, though, were from Virginia, some of them affiliated with Virginia Military Institute, and really felt very strongly that they were protecting their homeland and their families. This was a very personal war for them. Stonewall Jackson actually was very opposed to the war in the first place and only got involved when he was ordered by the Virginia military to report for duty. He tried to have a national day of prayer to encourage the South to oppose getting involved in the war. Robert E. Lee, of course, was a very significant figure in the reconciliation of the country after the war. Stonewall Jackson and Turner Ashby both died, I believe, either during the war or shortly after. So they were unable to participate in that way. But Robert E. Lee was someone who wouldn't even take a high-profile position after the war because he thought that it was considered so immoral to profit and become sort of a famous figure based off of what had happened. So he took a position at a small college, being the president there, and that was sort of what inspired this National Reconciliation Memorial in Arlington Cemetery that is also slated for removal. And so I think it's important to understand that context, because if we're comparing these three figures to schools that are named after George Washington or Thomas Jefferson, there's really not that much difference in terms of how they viewed slavery and the fact that they all probably owned slaves. So we have to be able to reconcile the bad things that people in American history did with the good that they did. And it's not always an easy question of, well, this person fought for the Confederacy, so they're bad. And as you said, just because somebody was on the northern side doesn't mean that they're good. Founding fathers often owned slaves. Many of them, of course, owned slaves. Thomas Jefferson was known for having sexual relations with his slaves. So he's not this perfect person either. But I think it's okay to recognize that someone has a complicated history and that we're honoring them for their positive contributions and not for their negative contributions. And unfortunately, this seems to always start with Confederate leaders, but it never stops there. We've seen people try to take down statues in Lafayette Square outside of the White House. There's been attempts to take down Jefferson monuments, to take down Lincoln monuments, George Washington-related monuments. These things are constantly vandalized and defaced with graffiti and people hanging off of them during protests around D.C. So it's a slippery slope to me that we start with these individuals because it's easy to say, oh, well, South bad, Civil War bad, but we don't really look at the full context, and that inevitably leads to people going after statues of the Founding Fathers as well.
Yeah, it's interesting the statistic you bring in of the background of how this came to be, of 91% of people in the district who are taxpayers in the district supporting the naming of the schools. But as someone who's lived in the South for a few years now, I've seen a lot of towns that are very segregated. And I think there are some towns that are just considered white towns, some towns that are still considered black towns, and colloquially are called that. In my high school, which is in Stamford, Connecticut, it's the part of Connecticut that sticks out into New York, but it's still a part of New England. We had our high school with two different cafeterias, and I went to the trade school, so I didn't eat in the main school's cafeterias really ever. But our principal even was caught referring to them as the white and black cafeterias, and that is what they were colloquially called, and they were self-segregated. And so, the history of racism and segregation and slavery is pretty recent in the United States. And so to think of a school district where the public schools are named this, it's almost communicating, this is a white town, and white people are the ones making the rules about it. Because I don't think black families would feel comfortable moving into this town. I think that's why there should be some kind of ruling nationally about this, because of what it signals to people who should feel comfortable moving to whatever town they get a job in the United States of America, regardless of, the naming of the school. And if the naming of the school is something that makes a whole community of people feel uncomfortable, I think that's something worth looking into under the requirements we have that everyone's, treated equally in the United States. And so while Thomas Jefferson and George Washington were bad guys, I think having a school be named after someone on one side of a war fought within the United States is alienating, especially considering the racial backgrounds. It's divisive. And so I don't think any school should be named after a general. Maybe they should be named after a great teacher from the past. Maybe not Thomas Jefferson or George Washington at all. Maybe someone who has, a cleaner record and was a good person, even by, today's standards of what makes a great man.
Yeah, I guess, again, we just got into, well, we should get rid of the George Washington and Thomas Jefferson names off of schools too. And I don't agree with that. I think most Americans don't agree with that. And so we get directly into this slippery slope of, okay, we're going to take down Confederate leaders, and then all of a sudden our founding fathers are the next one on the chopping block. And that gets to the point where I think we are erasing American history and being unwilling to grapple with the fact that
it'll still be taught in the schools, Amber. They just won't be named after them.
But why do you think we shouldn't name a school after George Washington? just because he owned slaves, like pretty much every wealthy American did at the time? Should we
Well, I
name
didn't
any?
say we shouldn't. I said there's better names that we could come up with. Maybe we shouldn't if there are better names, and that George Washington and Thomas Jefferson are not the same as the Confederate generals because that was a war fought with opposing sides within the country. So it's more divisive than someone who was the president.
Yeah, I mean, the Confederate generals we're talking about also had ancestors who fought in the Revolutionary War for American independence. Some of them fought bravely in the Mexican-American War and the War of 1812. So I just don't think it's useful to distill down their achievements and their legacy to them being on the wrong side of a war because they happened to be born in Virginia.
Yeah, I just don't think we need to name a school after them, especially when it's a war fought with opposing sides in this country and we have people moving across the North and the South. I think it's not about not honoring that legacy. Of course, that history will be taught in the classrooms, in the schools. It's really about, what it signals to everyone, what it means to everyone when you name the school and the town after a Confederate soldier. It really brings us back in history in a way that I don't think is necessary.
Yeah, I wish it were true that we would continue to teach the history, but we've already seen in the past that when the Robert E. Lee statue was taken down in Charlottesville, it was supposed to be moved to a museum so people could obviously learn about all of the complicated history surrounding it. Instead, it was smelted in the middle of the night without any community input or without even telling people that it was going to happen. And so I think really this is just the first step towards erasing history. And I don't buy that we can have it both ways, that we can remove any names or statues, et cetera, and we shouldn't worry because it'll be taught in the public schools. If history is any guide, actually erasing these statues and names is really just the first step to a larger type of tyranny. I know we're going to have to leave it there, but we'll be back with more Rising after this.